There's nothing magic about security which is different to bugs. A vulnerability is just a bug which has some use to somebody else in the world. When I think of security and best practices and everything else, the very first thing that I'm thinking about is this is just code quality. There's no reason why AI context wouldn't be able to identify these things far better. I do think we are reaching a place where all of the old SaaS companies are going to be replaced. Like Claude Code and Cursor are going to eat their lunch completely.
Hi, this is Brian Douglas, and you're listening to Open Source Ready, a bi-weekly series where we discuss the evolution of open source software and its impact on the tech landscape. Along with my co-host John McBride, we'll explore topics like open source AI, the business, end of life, and sustainability of open source. Open Source Ready is brought to you by Heavybit, the leading investor of developer-first startups. For more information, visit heavybit.com. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, find us at x.com/opensourceready. Welcome to another installment of Open Source Ready. John, we are back for another episode. You excited?
We're back. Yeah, I'm excited.
I've actually been super heads down and building a bunch of AI stuff.
Yeah.
I've been really getting into AI run loop containers. So run loop's a company specifically to run containers at scale. But the thing that's been coming up a lot with the team is security.
Yeah.
What are we doing about these tokens passing around? How do we leverage users and customers leverage this stuff? And I had no idea. I'm literally just kind of slinging from the hip on all this stuff. So I'm really excited to talk to Benji, who's our guest. Benji, you're coming from Tel Aviv. You want to say hello?
Thanks for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, pleasure. Yeah, so we got connected through mutual connections, and really looking forward to hearing your expertise on this space. But do you want to give us a quick intro of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so hi, Benji, and I'm the VP Engineering and one of the co-founders at a company called Root. What we're basically doing is what we call agentic vulnerability remediation, and what we're trying to do there is we're trying to basically patch all of open source and provide safe versions of open source packages to anyone who kind of wants to use them. The idea being that people can use these open source packages, especially those kind of running on containers, which people feel less comfortable working with and fixing, and use them entirely securely. And, all of this without moving to any kind of proprietary software or anything else. And that's our mission.
Excellent. Yeah. And you've got a bit of a background on this because I do know you from previously working at Snyk as well. But I did want to actually talk about an article that really just came out. It was around vibe coding and API explosion. So you actually wrote this article. So do you want to catch us up on this?
Thanks. So yeah, that was a really interesting piece that I think we pulled together. And I think what's so interesting about that is because it came out, I think, a month ago, I'd say that a lot of my thoughts have probably changed a little bit in terms of what was written there, just because everything is moving so fast in this field that it becomes really difficult to kind of keep up with everything. But the main thesis of what we're talking about there is basically vibe coding is bringing down all of the traditional rules that we used to have, basically the boundaries that we used to have to allow engineers or anyone to basically add code and specifically add new APIs or anything else into an existing software. And the idea here was, how do we find the right balance between allowing people to be creative and kind of go wild and add these type of stuff versus how do we then track and control for all of these different changes coming into our software? And how do we make sure that we're not introducing a huge amount of technical debt that we then need to kind of deal with? With the amount of APIs and the inability to necessarily track them, you are also introducing a whole bunch of security threats as well, as you're basically creating more and more of an attack surface for that to kind of go through. So that's the main thesis of kind of what we were sort of talking about there.
Yeah, and John, I don't know if you caught up with the article as well, but I know your day job works with the API gateways. I don't know if you have any additions to this conversation to add.
Yeah, it is a wild world right now where the velocity of changes that can happen inside of APIs. And really, these are just the interfaces that companies may be providing to clients or whomever to go and do capabilities. One of the classic examples at Zupo we talk about is just weather APIs and how, everybody's phone connects to some weather API to go, determine where you are and then get that data. And the velocity at which, you can start delivering more and more stuff with AI is interesting. And something we think about a lot is just the cost that may actually provide, or I guess the cost that people shipping these new things at a higher velocity may actually consume. So it's really, technical debt, I guess is what it's at. So yeah, Benji, I'm curious how you would recommend to people then they keep their technical debts low? Like, is there technologies that we have today? I mean, is Root doing anything in this space? People are vibe coding. People are shipping stuff. Like, what can we do to keep the technical debt low?
I think there's a couple of things here. So first of all, let's talk about the positives, which is what's happening is that people were reducing the levels of friction and the requirements that people needed in order to be able to, add features to their products. And that's a great thing because it means that we can move fast and cut through things and we can experiment. And we should really embrace that and be really, really happy that this is something that we have been given the ability to do. But I think that then, with the great power becomes great responsibility. And the first thing is just a mindset, which is, do I clean up after myself? So like, if anybody can add an API, do you let them immediately add that API and go straight to prod with it? Or are you doing some levels of checks and verification on what's going through? Because what happens inside a business is, somebody really wants to add a feature for a user. Somebody comes along now and says, I can add this in 5 seconds. There's no architectural review that it needs to go through. It's not limited by any of these human processes that we kind of had. And then that gets, added as an experiment. And then because it's successful, there's pressure on the business. Let's just deliver that quickly and just continue on. So some of this is really about how do we, even though we no longer have the limitations of these limitations don't exist, which limit us, how do we add these limitations to ourselves, responsibly as engineers and as practitioners and as businesses to do this? And I think that's one of the main things to sort of think through. The other really technological kind of thing is, how are we adding these APIs? Like, what is the mindset that goes into vibe coding? Because friends, there's vibe coding and then there's vibe coding. So, I mean, you can do it well and you can do it less well. So are people just, blindly, giving prompts to Cursor or to Claude and kind of seeing what happens? Or is there a thoughtful process? Is there a design process, even a vibe coding powered, but a design process that goes in, a spec that's created alongside Claude or whatever, or anything else, which you create with them before you begin adding that API? Is that spec then peer reviewed by someone else to sort of approve that before you begin the implementation stage? Like, are you adding tests alongside what it is that you're doing? And are there humans in the loop here? So I think there's a whole bunch of things we can do around vibe coding and best practices that are coming in that are really, really important just on that level. And the technological stuff, API visibility, like the tools exist out there for us to have visibility over APIs and what's being used. These are all classic tools that have existed for a long point of time. It's worthwhile us using them and worthwhile us making sure. But I really think that if you've gotten to that point that you're only monitoring things at the very end when you have 1,000 APIs out there, a lot of things have gone wrong in your engineering process before that. And I think that's where I would recommend people put a lot of their effort.
Yeah. It's fascinating because, I mean, a lot of these things you're talking about are really like classic engineering org problems, people problems that existed, long before AI tools were a thing. Having good engineering process to review a spec, review some docs, have good scaffolding and stuff to actually be able to, at the end result, test it, validate it, make sure that things are, in a good state. One thing recently that I forget who I was talking to, but they were talking about Google and how Google has what they would call like a better kitchen than a lot of people. And, the kitchen where you make your food, if you have this really amazing kitchen, then it's going to output some, really great stuff. And thinking about like Google's kitchen or the place that they actually have like process, tooling, environments, all this stuff, like to enable engineers, enable product teams to go and ship stuff in a sane way, even before the AI revolution and all this stuff. And now with all the Gemini stuff that they have capabilities in, the kitchen just continues to get better and better. So yeah, 100% on that. I think having the process and the people problems really hasn't changed a lot. It's maybe now just more painful with AI.
I think that conversation came up in our last episode with Chad, talking about continuous AI.
Oh, that's right. Was he talking about the kitchen?
He was talking about the kitchen. So folks, definitely, if you haven't listened to that episode yet, definitely go back and listen to that one. But I will say, like, to further this analogy is like, we're now in a place that we all have this industrial sized kitchen, which is now AI gives us like the tools that we could do things that we could not do prior. Like I can't build infrastructure because that's never been my job, but I've always worked with people who've done it. So I know enough to tell the AI what to do, but I still have not trained myself to like how to hold a knife properly or how to like sterilize the counter efficiently or keep everything up to code. And I think what you were kind of hinting at, And I'd be curious because you're VP engineering at your current role, is there like culture that you have to ingrain in the team to like, okay, we do engineering things. Hopefully we still do these things. Like at what point do we bring in like the reviews and then we start talking through some of the things that are happening or looking at vulnerabilities that are live in the wild, and how do we apply AI to that?
So I'd say like for us, we're both an AI company that like we develop a lot with AI and we also provide an AI solution. So, we hit this on both ends of the journey here. So first of all, as a VP of engineering first of all, obviously the scariest thing for my team is when I start adding code. So they need to do everything that they can to make sure that that doesn't happen, because obviously I'm the least capable person of doing that for my very, very skilled team. And I think coming from that point of view, the things that I'm there to do is to help provide the team with the boundaries of what we want to be doing in terms of a good engineering process. And there's a couple of things here which I think touch into AI. And some of them are processes, and some of these are really like technical implementations of how you kind of go about and do this. So in terms of technical implementation, some simple stuff to kind of do is basically be like, well, we're going to make sure that we have a single source of truth of repo where we have our cursor rules or our Claude rules, and we're all sharing the same rules that we're working from. And those can be added to by anybody in terms of, anybody inside the team if there's additional rules that need to be added, but that they're shared amongst everybody in terms of what we're doing. This is the kind of stuff that lived in documentation up until now. And to be honest, it's actually a little bit easier having it inside, a repo as opposed to having it in a Notion or a Confluence document, because one thing AI is better at is actually reading things than humans are. And as anyone who's done any management knows, getting humans to read documentation is a little bit more difficult. So having that single source of truth is really, really important in kind of doing this. And then it's about, how are you setting up your coding agent? So are you giving it access to all of the different repositories that it needs to have access to? So does it just have access to the single repo, or can you provide it with context on all of the different parts of your system? So it's able to provide the best type of solution to that. And if your system's too big, are you creating, documentation and spec, also AI powered, to explain to your coding agent what it should be doing, how the various bits of your system piece together so it knows to suggest things in the best possible way? And then I think like all of this is just basically setting up the context for how you're going to be doing your prompting and everything else. And then you get into the actual processes of this, which is really, as I kind of alluded to begin with, you want to break this down into several different stages. You want to break down vibe coding into a brainstorming stage where you're basically, you're brainstorming, you're coming up with an idea, you've been given a feature, so you want to try and understand what's the best way of doing this. And you're basically trying to be a product manager with your AI agent and create with it the best possible spec that you can to then begin that implementation. And I mean, that should be something which you spend a couple of hours on, even just sort of like piecing that together and building that. And then making sure that you have a process which says, okay, and then I want someone else to review this. And that could be the product manager. It could be another engineering. It could be me, it can be anybody in terms of that, to make sure that you have that right process of the review of the spec before it then begins the implementation. And then the stage which says, write the test for all of this. Make sure that you're actually testing everything that needs to happen before we write a single line of code. What is the test scenarios? So just like if I were to get a PR, the very first thing I would look at is a test, right? Because that actually explains to me what's the logical thing that's supposed to be happening. So having those testing and those unit tests, for you to be able to verify that what's going to happen is going to be the right thing. And then, hey, spitting it out and having it actually try and do what you're doing. And then even after that, running tests with it. And again, one of the great things that an AI agent can do, we do a lot of work with containers and everything else. Like, we're using Canaco to like build containers and do all this different stuff. And to be honest, it's quite annoying to spin that up myself and to kind of elude it. And it gets to the very edge, Brian, as you were saying, the edge of my kind of own technical ability. But if I can just have an agent do that to me and test the literal feature that I'm about to add locally in its own environment, and then learn from that and improve all of these, and you turn these into regular processes that you have your people do, this is something which you get at the end of the day, you get much better results from the vibe coding that you get. So that's kind of how we're trying to tackle this. And it's also something that we're talking about with like other engineering teams and like trying to explain to them how we're being successful with these tools. And a lot of it just comes down to the AI is magic, great. What is the right process to turn that magic into something which is most useful to you?
Yeah, and I was listening to a podcast today about students in Berkeley using AI and how it's been like a hit or miss for teachers. But then they also went to Berkeley, the UC Berkeley, and also investigated and found that like professors are having a great time with AI because the difference is like when you know how to do it yourself, like it's an accelerant, like amplified developers, like that's an experience that it's just going to continue to 10x people. But when you come with like no information and you have no edge cases or you don't know what you don't know, that's where people are kind of really getting like the weird vibe coding, security vulnerabilities, issues. And I think the way you sort of broke it out is like really a clear playbook of like you kind of really need to sit down and think about what you're doing first. And if you don't know what you're doing first, like start reading the books and start traversing documentation as a human first, because if you don't know, again, you know how to interact with the agent, then you're going to basically give yourself a foot gun.
Maybe it's time we call it something else.
Yeah.
Not vibe coding. I mean, all that, like, yeah, having context, having awareness of like what you're doing and what you're actually going to be accomplishing. I think this was another thing in the last episode that Chad was saying was, what are you trying to do? Like, what are you actually trying to do? And if, you're in the kitchen with a bunch of sharp knives and you don't know, then you're going to cut a finger off or something, or I guess foot gun. But like Benji was saying as well, like a lot of that around this whole process, it sounds to me an awful lot like, it's not really like waterfall, it's not really like agile, but it sounds like a new other thing, some engineering process that really, I think, elevates the AI experience. Vibe coding just gets such a weird rap in my mind because I sort of think about like, the airplane game that, what was that guy, Levels on X was making, and it was like super broken, but it was a wildly successful product because he had all the marketing and all the reach. But for like real engineering teams that need to like maintain software over long periods of time, I just wonder if we call it something else.
There's a subreddit now called context engineering. And I feel like that's the best term that I've seen so far. And I'm curious, Benji, if you've seen this as well, where you provide all the context. And that's kind of what you were explaining is like, get that context of the docs and know like where things are, have your rules. And what I've been doing a ton of is like the rules will point to the external link. So then the agent can go ask permission to say, hey, can I go search for this link? So yeah, you're kind of giving it some gates to interact with. But if it doesn't need that link, you can just say no, continue working. But have you heard the term context engineering yet?
I've not had context engineering, but I think it does describe very well kind of what we're talking about, because more and more it's becoming around context management. Like that is what I was describing earlier as well, in terms of if the code base gets too big, you need to begin like scaling down, creating like smaller documents which describe the code base so it doesn't have to look. That's context management as well, in terms of making sure that you're restricting what goes in, so it doesn't go off in like some crazy loop, but also because, that really hampers its ability to actually do proper output if the context is too large. And maybe with AI, the arms race between the different models, the context will just get bigger and bigger. But I still think that, you're never going to have a context which is the entire internet, right? Or every known piece of information. There is still going to be advantages of expressly telling what it is that it does or doesn't know, or at the very least being able to have that question and answer session at the beginning to get to the point where you understand what it is that it should or shouldn't know, and then only provide that context in the second stage. That's an important thing. And I don't think it's different from how we always engineered. Like I think you're right, John, like when you came to a task as a human, you had a huge amount of context on all of the different things that can be done. And you're given this feature that needs to be implemented in the system. I've seen engineers get lost because, where in the system should I begin? And there's too many different things and I don't know where to go. So as engineers, we've always context managed and said, it makes the most sense that I should add it in this, like this feature in this service, with this storage. And that makes sense because I know that there's another API that looks like similar. So we did that when we implemented this. And now it's about making sure that we implement those same best practices inside the AI world. And I think when people get overexcited about AI and they do think it's just magic rather than a physical thing, which exists in the real material world, they forget that these best practices are still going to be relevant. They can be adjusted for sure, but it's not like we've moved into a plateau where you can simply say to the agent, here are the thing, just go ahead and do it, zero additional context asked, because it just won't work.
So I wanted to go back to our original topic about the security part too as well. And I've got a very specific use case where I'm building a bunch of stuff. So I run DevRel for an AI coding agent called Continue. And I'm building a bunch of Skunkworks side projects to expand our product. I'm not full-time engineering. All I do is create tech debt, but I'm very cautious about that, where I don't want to build stuff that's going to like put the team at risk of like, hey, Brian shipped something, it's working, we've got 100,000 users on it. But it turns out there was like a security vulnerability where like the token was passed in a weird spot. And we spent last episode talking about the CodeRabbit issue that came out a few weeks ago, but it's been, I guess it was originally disclosed 6 months ago. That was the story. So I'm like constantly thinking through, okay, hey, model, the code I'm about to ship, please do a hardcore security review, which I'm trusting the model to like, okay, you search the web, you do the thing. I'm trusting you to check the bases and make sure things are covered. But I imagine there's a better way, and it's probably do something. So I insert some blink. So I'm curious, Benji, like how do you make sure your team's up to speed in what they're doing and not just sort of like shooting from the hip for almost everything when it comes to AI?
So to me, I don't think there's anything magical. And from like a lot of years dealing with security. So again, both in offensive and defensive in terms of the security world, there's nothing magic about security which is different to bugs. A vulnerability is just a bug which has some use to somebody else in the world. So when I think of security and best practices and everything else, the very first thing that I'm thinking about is this is just code quality, just like anything else out there. So the type of best practices that we're implementing around best quality of code. And the same way that I wouldn't want to introduce a bug that was a security bug and I'm trying to protect against that. So that's the same thing that I'm doing around security implementation as well. And I think as a business, we put a higher premium on security. And as somebody who sells security product, I'm very thankful for that. But the reason that we do that is because of like risks that are involved in that in terms of what that could mean. But when we're actually implementing as engineers, my system to this is the same system that it would be around all quality, which is you need to ensure the quality levels at every single stage of what we're doing. And I think that the process that we described helps out with that quite a bit. And then the tools that the existing tools that we have out there, be they, SaaS tools and all these other types of tools that we kind of used to, I think they have their place to still run and use them to get some indication. But I think those results today then get fed into an agent to then be to say, hey, Sneak found these vulnerabilities inside your code base. Can you verify whether or not this is true? And I do think we are reaching the place where all of the old SaaS companies are going to be replaced. Like, Claude Code and Cursor are going to eat their lunch completely because there's no reason why AI, context wouldn't be able to identify these things far better. It's not yet primed to do that. It's not yet taught to do that. So I think you just combine the two elements in order to make sure that this happens. But I think you would do the exact same thing if when you run it through a linter. And I mean, that's what we're doing now, right? Cursor or Claude is running your linter and then, reacting to what's going on there. So it should be running your security checks and reacting to what's going on. And you should keep a human in the loop to make sure. But ultimately, I'll put it this way, the main security risk is almost always going to be the port that you leave open. It's not going to be the XSS that you necessarily add. It's going to be, that's where the main security risk, and pointing that towards your infrastructure and making sure that your infrastructure is as safe as possible, your tokens are as safe as possible, is still the best practice and the safest way to go.
So I am super curious your take on this from integrating AI agents or AI capabilities into things, especially hot on the heels of this big compromise that me and my team just had to deal with in this build tool called NX. They had a couple packages that, it was caught super quickly because it was a huge compromise. It was like over an hour or so that basically if you had NX build tooling inside of your repo or your org, it would then make a new repo, Singularity something repo or whatever, and then actually go and steal a bunch of tokens. And the way that this worked was in a post-install script that actually fed something to Claude or Gemini CLI on your system and basically was like, hey, Claude, go and crawl the passwords file and just dump it and send it here. And this was very novel because NPM, obviously, a lot of these security encoding package tools will index code. And because this whole thing was shoved into a prompt, just a string, it couldn't actually do code indexing on it. So it got around all that. Anything that would just crawl a passwords file and you try to publish it to NPM would immediately get flagged and taken down. we've gone beyond that, at least with like code indexing and stuff. So my hot take, especially having have to deal with this, my hot take is that introducing LLMs and introducing, coding agents and AI agents into the security loop actually like dramatically increases the surface area of potential vulnerabilities and operations that threat actors can do. And doesn't this more wax poetically kind of become a whole alignment problem in AI and ML, where if we can't get large language models to properly align, i.e., if I can just do a prompt injection telling it to go and crawl, a bunch of password files, telling it to, hey, ignore security predicates that you were told in your system message, doesn't that become a much bigger problem, like across the surface area of all your software?
Kind of a leading question, but I'm going to have to answer yes then. I think this is very true. I think that but what we're seeing here is just the naivety and earliness of the language. And this is a maturity cycle which everything goes through. So like when NPM first came out, there weren't even CVEs published on it. Like it was like the community was supposed to take responsibility, the CVEs inside the packages, and that didn't necessarily work. And that's why Sneak and other sort of companies came along. And then there was the malicious packages, ability to add malicious packages to NPM became this massive thing because there was no protection there. And posting stool scripts, as you mentioned, there was no protection on posting stool scripts. So, and this has also been true every time we have a new language sort of that comes out, every time there's been a new package management system, the level of compromisability of VS Code through plugins. Like we did a big research into this back in the day, which is just basically the amount of nobody's taking responsibility for the plugin store and like VS Code, and it will do pretty much whatever, and it's your IDE. So a lot of these things exist up and out of the beginning because security comes second. First comes the excitement and the froth, the hype cycle. Then you have the massive breach. It could be the Equifax, back in the day, whatever that big breach is, which suddenly creates this pressure in the industry around protection. And then things tend to mature out. So I think where we are in the AI world is that we're at that crescendo of we've got a lot of this froth, which makes it a massive target, as you're saying, because we don't yet have all of those protections in place, but that it will taper out and get to that point of protection. Now, what do you do in the meantime is the main question. The problem is here, and this is the obvious thing, that if you say, well, I'm not going to use agents, so I'm just going to code in the same way that I've been doing up till now, from a business point of view, it will be very difficult for you to compete at the delivery and the velocity of people who are using those tools.
Yeah.
Much in the same way that if you would say, well, I'm not going to use NPM until they do all of the protection you did, I'm going to write all of those libraries myself, you would find yourself at a disadvantage competing against those people who are pulling in NPM libraries. So that is where, at every point in time, we as practitioners need to find the best way of basically, yes, using the tools available, but trying to do that in a protected format. And ultimately, risks involved, security risks as a whole, you need to then ask yourself, who's actually going to be utilizing them? How truly at risk I am of breach in terms of, even if something comes out there, is there a threat actor who is interested enough in me to want to attack me? How much effort are they willing to put in order to do this? Like what are the worst end results that could be? Do I have mitigating defenses in place in order to protect against this? Ultimately, security is a big numbers game. So I would never say to somebody, don't use a new tool which could push you forward a lot just because you're afraid of the security impact. Put mitigations in place, do all of these different things. But the likelihood is you aren't going to be breached, and get cyber insurance for those cases when you are.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I think that's kind of the weird middle ground we're in right now. It reminds me of like malpractice insurance. A lot of doctors get malpractice insurance, but the ones that really need malpractice insurance are like ER docs, people doing trauma surgery, orthopedic surgeons, because those can go very wrong. And often there's like a swath of lawyers who are ready to come after you. Maybe the analogy here is, it's the nation states ready to come after you for, these high value targets. Yeah, that's really good advice, actually. Brian, do you continue have, kind of a direction you've been thinking about moving with some of this? And like, I know talking with Chad last week that the container security stuff was top of mind.
Yeah, we're thinking about like how we interact. So the way Continue work is that it originally started as like you run it local with Olama on your machine. So everything goes through your machine, you control it. And it's actually been super, super nice with the enterprise customers where we don't need access to your information. Like it's on your team to manage that across whatever. So that's been super helpful. So now everything else we do, we interact with that sort of mindset of, okay, what actually comes to continue and what actually doesn't come to continue. And we've been able to build a product around that. So not to make this a podcast about continue, but like if you want a local first open source coding agent, definitely check it out. I think it's been useful because folks at large enterprises are now running continue at scale inside of their network and behind their firewall, and it's working pretty well. So as an alternative for folks who don't want to like send data, send keys, tokens, and stuff like that, that's how it works. And the thing I've been working on is like a continue agent that runs in GitHub. So what my struggle is really is like I need to build a container that's sandboxed that only has access to what I need, but doesn't need the whole code base, doesn't need like all your private information. With another caveat of like, once you install this thing onto your repo, this is what we're adding and this is what we have access to. So that's what I work on later today. But yeah, it's a fascinating like problem right now because we have a bit of a land grab right now when it comes to all these review bots, all these like AI agents that are now moving from your editor, from your terminal. I think you had mentioned Claude Code a few times, or Claude. They have a really good security action that does have extra context around security and CVs to be able to run alongside of like your PR review at time of PR review. So yeah, it is a bit of like, there are a lot of SaaS companies that are probably going to be consolidating moving forward or expanding their footprint. So it'd be really interesting in the next few months. And I think actually probably a few weeks, to be quite honest, to see what happens.
Yeah, this whole conversation kind of reminds me of an announcement I recently saw from Anthropic about they've put in like extra guardrails to prevent Sonnet and Opus from telling you how to build a nuclear weapon, which, just got this podcast on a list or something. But that was a legitimate threat, or I guess a concern that a lot of these AI safety researchers have is that, you could use these large language models, which have consumed the entirety of human written existence, including stuff that could legitimately enable you to build a nuclear weapon, a bioweapon, something like this. But now Anthropic is saying that they've built in additional safety measures. I guess you could say I'm like ML researcher curious. I don't have a background in any of this, but I'm so curious how they did this because it seems very close to problems like this, where it's like the individual developer obviously doesn't want to get accidentally pwned by running Claude or some LLM or something that has access to tools and mechanisms to run legitimate software on your computer, just like Anthropic wouldn't want to accidentally tell how to build a nuclear weapon or something. Benji, I want to loop it back to Root and what you all are doing with containers and all this. Have y'all thought about, the container space and like how that correlates with AI and how this whole space with AI could, be solved for?
So we look at containers as, first of all, as the unit at which we try and run protection, specifically in the open source components involved there. So what we do is users give us their image. We analyze that image, we find the vulnerabilities inside the packages. That's something which like everyone can do now. That's trite. But what we then do is we design an upgrade plan for that based on least amount of breaking changes, all of the vulnerabilities involved. And that involves, upgrading to the, if you're using Debian Bookworm, and Debian Bookworm has a fix, we'll do that. But if they don't, what we'll then do is we'll see that you're using a package which is vulnerable to a vulnerability. Debian haven't released a fix for that. An agent will then begin running, looking for any fix for that vulnerability, basically anywhere in the world. It could be the upstream, maybe, Ubuntu have done it. They'll find that and they'll then try and apply that fix to the version that's being run inside that container. And then we'll basically, if successful, we'll create that new package and install it inside the container. And we're able to do this thanks to, agents being language agnostic. We're able to do this across all the different languages and all the different like ecosystems that we can sort of support. And you're able to then create basically hardened images for peanuts for people. And this is something which, there are companies out there, I don't know, like the Chain Guards of the world, or even like the Red Hats who are charging like hundreds of thousands of dollars for creating, these secure images because there are people who need them. But with the AI out there, you can do this very easily for far lower cost and make it much more available to a lot of people out there. And I think that's the first kind of thing that we're sort of doing in the container world, but we're also just looking in general at the other type of stuff that we could do now that we have the container and we're playing with it and we have agents that are smart enough. How else would you make this container more hardened? How else would you protect it, which isn't just fixing vulnerabilities. And all of this trying to still with the context and the and the limitation of don't break the container, friend. Let users still be able to use their code and run on it. So this is kind of how we're sort of tackling this problem specifically in security in the container world. And then in terms of like agent running on containers, I mean, I think that's obviously the way forward. And Docker like pushing this and everything and all of this. But we also do that. The way that we run our fleet basically is spinning up instances of Argo to orchestrate each node that we need in order for like to have an individual agent run on it. That way we also, no agents know what the other, don't have context and anything else, can't poison each other, and just kind of manage a whole fleet through that using like classic, the classic basic like Kubernetes, Argo, Carpenter type of like infrastructure to basically manage this whole game.
Yeah, that is actually really fascinating. I worked at AWS years ago on this project called Bottle Rocket, which is a container-based operating system. And we thought about trying to tackle this problem. This was before AI. And the way we thought about doing this was using Amazon's internal ginormous build system called Brazil, which is basically like they went and invented NPM and Gradle before they were like a thing. And so we thought like we get flagged for a CV in these containers. We automatically go out to Gradle to try to build a new patch for that software or something. And I mean, it was kind of an untenable solution because we literally would have had to boil the ocean. But with AI, I definitely see that vision. With AI, it has semantic reasoning on like these fixes that it can go out and get. Right? Am I kind of understanding that correctly?
Yeah. That's basically it. Like, I mean, backporting has always been this nightmare, right? Like it's just dirty work. John, I'll posit to you two things. It was a lot of work, and it was work that you didn't want to do.
Yeah.
Where is the glory in backporting, like hundreds of fixes onto old packages? Like, I mean, not many people want to sit down and do that every day, all day. So, I mean, that's part of an issue. But hey, AI doesn't mind. AI is our friend. And that is a place where you can begin solving these kind of like engineering problems where there was a solution. It was just slightly too complex for and if logics of what to do, but not like, out of the realms of possibility. And, if given enough time, we as humans could have done it, but we didn't want to. So now there's something else out there which can do it. We still need to be in the loop. This is very clear. Like you can't just let it run wild. Like it will do some wonky shit if you don't like keep an eye on try and do this. But getting that kind of like complete build systems, and Amazon aren't the only people. Google do this. A lot of the big banks do this, have their own internal repositories where they're building all of this, but they're just spending thousands of man hours on it. Now you could do it, anyone can have that in their back pocket, basically.
Yeah. I can personally validate this because after I left Amazon and they were doing a bunch of stuff with their AI infrastructure, I saw something that Andy Jassy, the CEO at Amazon, said about how they'd written, hundreds of thousands of lines of code, updating all these things from, Java 18 or whatever up to better standards. And I was like, I know exactly what that patch looks like. It's in Brazil and it's not that exciting, but it's a perfect use case for AI, just like you described. You just let it get in there and like go make those little tweaks and those patches to these things that would have been like very boring for any Amazon team and probably would not have led to a lot of promotions. So nobody wanted to go do it. So yeah, I can validate that. Yeah, your approach makes a ton of sense.
Cool. Benji, real quick, if the listeners want to stay educated on security, containers, where would you point them to?
I think a lot of what the information that I'm gathering now is from like the main sources. So like, looking at everything that Anthropic and Google and like everyone else is kind of dropping is really important. They're dropping tons of new information all the time, keeping up to date. The other thing is, just around like there's some really, really good stuff now in Medium in terms of like a lot of different blogs out there that I'm subscribing to and using from their system. The Pragmatic Engineer is a great blog. I don't know if you guys know it, but it's like it's an amazing blog historically, but he's doing some really great work now also in AI and kind of best practices and everything around that. And then finally, just keeping it loose on Twitter and basically seeing what happens and also asking AI a lot about updates in AI and kind of what's the latest news.
Cool. Yeah, well, appreciate that. And at this point, we're going to transition to read. So Benji, question to you. Are you ready to read?
Yeah, let's do it.
Read.
So, John, you had some reads, some articles. Do you want to catch us up on what you've been reading?
Yeah, two spicy ones. First was that Google supposedly is only going to allow verified apps and verified developers on Android, which is a kind of massive departure from, Android's more open ecosystem compared to an iOS ecosystem where you could sideload apps. There's like whole like forks of Android, like purpose built for security around this whole idea of like being able to sideload a bunch of stuff. A little wild. I'm super curious how this is going to impact the open source ecosystem around Android. It really was kind of a OG sort of type of project. I would put it in the same camp as like Chrome and Kubernetes. Yeah, kind of wild that it's going that direction though. Either of you on Android?
I am on Android, yeah. I'd love to say it was for all of the beautiful reasons that you just said. I'm more on Android because it's cheaper. So, and it does the job. So, I mean, that's a good one for me. I hadn't heard that. And I do think that is wild because I think that like in general, Google's positioning now, and I think like Google's maturing as a company as we're kind of seeing it, and maybe reactions to various lawsuits and stuff against it and, potential breakups. They're beginning to put additional protections and everything in place from what they see as their IP and kind of like trying to make additional dollars, but they haven't made dollars before. Like what's the point? Like they're going to charge people for being, Android developers and everything else. So I think it is, this is a way for them potentially to increase revenue. I don't think it's a good thing for the community at large. It might be a good thing for Google to do from a business point of view. As an open source practitioner or practitioners, that's wild.
Yeah. I had the exact same take that it really was monetarily driven, probably, just given that they, seem to be having competitors from every direction on the ad search business. I have it on good word in the Kubernetes community that internal to GCP and Google's, whole cloud division, that them open sourcing Kubernetes the way that they did and really just giving it away, in hindsight, it's like a huge mistake. And they wish they could retcon that, but I doubt they can or ever would be able to, given how CNCF has taken over that. Brian, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I actually had Android up until last year. I would take my Android International because the Google Fi was like the best option. And then my provider for my iPhone made it better. So I didn't need two phones. But yeah, also surprised like where Android's like to sort of like, it's a place where you had like lower friction to get things deployed if you wanted to like get involved in developing. Actually, my first attempt at developing was building Android apps. I failed miserably, never actually deployed anything and shipped anything there. But that's what got me really interested back when I was in college. But yeah, it's sad to see this change, but also like we're seeing a lot of different changes as these like big conglomerates, big clouds, they're course correcting. And like we're seeing this with even smaller companies who are trying to sort of do a land grab and like close the ecosystem. I was actually I wanted to like share a Reddit post. And I think I was trying to grab the social card because I'm like, oh, it'd be great to have the social card of the Reddit post to like have that screenshot to share. And it blocked me because I was like scraping it directly from Reddit. It was like, oh, you can't scrape Reddit.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, oh, okay, this is interesting. Like, I get it. I get why they're doing this because of like financial reasons. But that amount of friction is like, oh, maybe I just don't like share Reddit posts anymore.
Well,
wild.
I think that's the risk that they're running. Like, when everything's free, people don't mind it. You have to start paying for stuff. People will be more judicious about where they're going to spend those dollars. And I think that will lead to this additional tightening of the market that we were sort of talking about, because people are going to have to choose where they want to spend that money and, what they're willing to give up on.
Yeah, totally. Well, speaking of the market, I'll go on to my next one, which is that the US government, and we almost always try to steer away from politics on this podcast, but here we are. The US government is taking a 10% stake in Intel. And this is a personally crazy saga for me because I worked at VMware when Pat Gelsinger was there. He went to Intel. He was huge in making the CHIPS Act happen and then got kind of, voluntold to leave. And now there's some other people at the helm. And yeah, Intel is just longer saga of like kind of, I think in the public zeitgeist is kind of a failure, I guess. If I was going to go build a new PC today, I definitely would not pick an Intel chip personally. I know some people would, but it's a little wild. Yeah, I saw some people calling this a bailout, that, Intel is too big to fail. So, government is going to go take a stake, give them a bunch of money. A little crazy.
Yeah, I don't want to weigh in on American politics either, to be honest. But
There you go.
but I think in terms just of Intel, if we look at Intel and we look at Nvidia and everything else, I think it's just really interesting to look at where Intel have ended up and kind of what's happened there. And I think we see these cycles in the market as well. And I wouldn't count Intel out because like look at where Microsoft was, only a few years ago, and look where they've sort of rallied to and kind of come back to.
Yeah.
But they look like they're going to be in the wilderness for a bit. And it looks like they made some bad bets. And unfortunately, they made some bad bets on hardware, which we're all software engineers. It's much easier for us. But like when you pick up hardware, it's a lot more difficult, but it takes a lot more time and money to course correct. We can just scrap our code and start rewriting from scratch.
Yeah.
That's not the same with chips. And I think that's where they're finding themselves now.
They really needed the ARC line of GPUs to like be a success, not only for like the consumer market, but really enterprise to go and compete with NVIDIA. And it was unfortunately not that great.
So I have a coworker who's from Korea, and like he was explaining on how the Korean government is like has their hands in almost every single thing when it comes to the tech. I guess if I had a speculation, it's like America's just basically following suit with like how everything else operates outside of America. But like that's also a naive take as well, because there's a lot of nuance to that discussion and conversation. But I could also just say it's interesting, like definitely something to pay attention to moving forward.
Yeah, +1.
Unfortunately, I'm an economist as well. South Korea was founded with government intervention. Like there are no companies which weren't involved in it. Like that was how the Tigers basically, back in the 60s and everything rose to prominence. So South Korea and Japan, for instance, have always played in this way. America's always played in a slightly different way. It's been very successful for them. I think it's probably still going to be a successful like makeup overall, but it's not like there's not been bailouts before for companies inside America. I don't think it's a massive change of pattern. I think it's just right now, point in time, Intel needs some help, and potentially that's what it's getting.
Yeah. I don't know this, but I'd be very curious to understand if any American tech company like this had needed this kind of bailout before, and like how that went in the past. Because it seems that maybe the Silicon Valley Bank thing is a close comparison. That was like a year or two ago.
Yeah. It didn't quite take ownership, but like when the automakers had a bunch of issues back during the Obama time, yeah, there was a bit of a bailout and a bit of like oversight that was instituted, but I don't think the ownership was actually passed to. And I could be wrong on that. I know I could like ask ChatGPT real quick to catch me up on that, but I'll digress and not go in a whole rabbit hole there.
Yeah. Not economists, listeners. Be sure to remember that. But Brian, you had a few picks as well, didn't you?
Yeah, I've got some two quick ones, which Stack Overflow survey results came out this week. So I think it's like 41% folks are using AI. I think the majority of the use cases are software engineering. So not surprised. Like I think it is very relevant, and folks are using AI to solve problems. And yeah, it's definitely worth looking at the survey results. Like it's an upward trend on people adopting AI. So the conversation around security is definitely a valid one. I guess the real question is like Stack Overflow. Like it's doing the survey results, but just checking in. When was the last time we looked at Stack Overflow?
Recently, actually. I mean, it was only the most esoteric thing ever. So I was like, well, I'm going in the weeds.
Yeah, I got to get some historical records, which, man, I think maybe last summer I dropped a Stack Overflow post into Copilot to like unblock myself because I was like, all right, I know I can get to this. And you always got to go through all the back and forth and like the folks who you don't quite get the answers, but then you get the marked answer that's not the answer, but then the one that's not marked answer is the one you need. So I did do that last summer, but it's been a while since I needed to leverage Stack Overflow.
One thing I would love is if the Stack Overflow ecosystem of websites, because there's actually so many. There's like a mathematics one and literature and just so many of these different communities. I would actually love if they competed with like Reddit, because it seems that Reddit and that more like social communities is going the direction of, I don't know what you would call it, like AI-ification. And I would love if there was like more human-centric community-basis stuff in the Overflow ecosystem of websites, but I don't know if that makes sense for their business. Probably not. But every once in a while, I'll browse the like literature and science fiction. Are they Stack Overflows? How do they call themselves?
Stack Exchange.
Yeah. it's fun to browse those.
Excellent. And then it's relevant to the conversation we were having earlier, which I wrote a blog post yesterday about pre-commit hooks are back. And it was like super relevant what you were mentioning earlier, Benji, about rules and like setting up the context. I got super annoyed with the AI model, just like constantly just brick and linting and like making choices that like I already made a decision about, like we've got the rule. And sometimes I'm finding where you have so much, I think Sonnet just announced their 1 million context window now. So you can get 1 million context tokens specifically in Sonnet. But that's a lot of context. So like when the compacting happens, usually it forgets parts of the pieces that are important. So now I have a pre-commit hook that I set up, which I hate pre-commit hooks. I hate when I commit and like I've got an error or I got a message. I'm like, no verify. But now like in Python, I've written a script for pre-commit hooks. Like everything I'm doing has a pre-commit hook so that the agent will just stop and look at the error and fix it before we go to PR.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that, like, if again, it's like a new use for an old tool,
Yeah.
but it's one that makes a lot of sense in this context. The pre-commit hook used to be for us to remember to do various things, and to do it now, it's reminding the agent that it needs to do all of these different steps. And I mean, I think if there's a simple way of doing it, you can prompt and reprompt it to try and get it to remember to lint every time. Or please stop writing these giant commit messages. I just want a small commit message, please. But like, if there's already a simple tool out there which does that, we should use those simple tools. We shouldn't be using like AI or AI techniques for the sake of it. Like, there's no good reason to do that.
Yeah, I did see Scott Hanselman has recently did a post around like we're using AI to basically build scripts and like bash scripting and stuff like that, where like there's already a proven model for us to like build scripts to make things work and like have a process and things, like have a run book. But like we're over engineering like these SaaS applications with AI to do things that we've already solved for like 10, 20, 15 years ago. So yeah, so it's interesting to take a step back and be like, oh, I've seen this before. I know how to apply my knowledge to this problem. But the scary part is like there are new college grads and folks that are junior who just don't know what they don't know. And they might over-engineer something because AI got them into that place.
Well, I mean, this goes right down to that like idea of limitations. Like if you say, if you give a human, create a cache library, they're going to download a cache library. If you tell AI, I need a cache library, they're going to create a cache library from scratch. They're going to write 8,000 lines of code in order to do that. This is basically where human intelligence versus AI intelligence differs. And, we need to be in the loop to keep it on track.
Yeah, 100%. Well, with that, Benji, thanks so much for staying up late with us and chatting about, honestly, so many different topics. So folks, definitely find Benji online in our X. All his information will be in the show notes. And listeners, stay ready. That's all the time we have for today. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you'd like to suggest a topic, find us at x.com/opensourceready. Open Source Ready is brought to you by Heavybit, the leading investor of developer-first startups. For more information, visit heavybit.com.